In this lesson, we'll review the process for installing a new domain controller. If you don't have the Windows Server operating system installed yet, make sure that you do that first. Once the server is ready, the system needs to have several important parameters configured. Let's look at these parameters now. The first thing to configure is a server's name. It's extremely difficult to change the computer name after Active Directory is installed, so it's best to set the name beforehand. The next thing to configure is the system time and time zone. This is critical because the Active Directory relies on Kerberos. Kerberos doesn't allow more than a 5-minute difference between different systems in a domain. This means that no system, including servers, workstations, and member servers, can have their time off by more than 5 minutes. Otherwise, it can cause errors. It's also best if you assign the server a static IP address. It's possible to have the IP address dynamically assigned, but this will cause problems if DHCP gives it a different IP address than it had when you first installed Active Directory. It won't run smoothly if the IP address changes. Next, you need to decide what to do about the domain name system, or DNS. There are a couple of options available for handling DNS. On a small network with a very small number of domain controllers, you could put the DNS service on the same system as the Active Directory Domain Services, or ADDS, and it should work just fine. But if you're working on a large network, this won't work as well. On a big network, consider setting up a separate server and then installing Active Directory Domain Services on one server and the DNS server on a separate box. This would dedicate each box to just one role and provide more scalability than having both services on the same box. Next, decide how you're going to install Active Directory. If no domain currently exists, you need to create a new domain in a new forest, and you need to choose a root name to assign to that domain. On the other hand, if a domain already exists in your network, you'll need to decide how you want to integrate the domain controller into the existing domain. You have two choices. You can either add the domain to an existing Active Directory domain, or you can add a new domain in an existing Active Directory forest. With these prerequisites completed, you're ready to install the domain controller. The way the server operating system was installed will determine your options for installing the Active Directory Domain Services role. If you have a desktop experience with a GUI, this will allow navigation through the Add Roles and Features wizard. Then you can just use Server Manager to install the Active Directory role. If you're working with the Windows Server system without a GUI installed, for example, if you're dealing with a server core deployment, you can install Active Directory using PowerShell commandlets. In order to do this, use the Install Windows Feature commandlet and then specify the role name you want to install, which is AD Domain Services. You can also install the management tools, known as the ADDS deployment modules, at the same time. These tools are necessary to promote the server to a domain controller. Installing the management tools is done by including the commands shown here. The next stage of installation is to promote the server. There are several options available to do this. If your server has a desktop experience, you can click on the option displayed in Server Manager after the role has been installed. Alternatively, you can open Windows PowerShell and use the ADDS deployment modules. If these weren't present when you installed ADDS from the command line, you can install them now using the import module, ADDS deployment commandlet. With the ADDS deployment modules installed, you'll then run one of 3 commandlets. The one you choose will depend on how you want the domain controller configured. If you're installing the first domain controller in a new forest, use the Install ADDS Forest commandlet. This is the best option if a domain is already configured on your network. Essentially, you're creating the domain in the new forest, and you're installing the first domain controller there. If you already have a domain configured on your network and you want to install an additional domain controller on that domain, use Install ADDS Domain Controller instead. This takes the server and promotes it to a domain controller inside of an existing domain. No new domains or forests are created with this commandlet. Finally, if you want to create a new child domain inside of an existing domain and then promote your server to be the first domain controller inside of that new child domain, use the Install ADDS Domain commandlet. That's it for this lesson. In this lesson, we reviewed the process for installing a new domain controller. We first looked at several prerequisite steps to perform before installing the domain controller. Then we talked about installing the Active Directory Domain Services role on the server. We ended this lesson by discussing how to promote the server to a domain controller.